you know, if you couldn't pass the people on the road, you most certainly could not honk. And another voice came back saying, well, I would have tailgated. And I would say, well, you know, if you couldn't pass, you couldn't honk, you certainly couldn't tailgate either. But this shows you how far we've come. That they found it, they just said, well, I couldn't have taken it. And I say, my point exactly. And so that is, you know, to get to the point as to why the people left and why it was often difficult for them to talk about it, why this became an underreported story, because even the people themselves didn't talk about it. Anybody who read this book in the first 6 months of its being out knew more about these people than did the families, the children of the people, and the grandchildren. And that's because they had not told anyone. And so we have come a very long way from those days. We have a long way to go as well.
We have come a long way. The election of Barack Obama in the minds of many people was a signal that look how far we've come in the span of 40 years dating back to those turbulent late 60s. But in many ways, as we're about to discuss, Steve, and I'll include you as well, Isabel, economic systems, still systems of segregation that exist in many corners, every pocket of this country. Steve, you're intimately involved in one of those cases that brought so much attention to South Carolina about the public school system. And I say minimally adequate education. A lot of people are aghast, but what principally were you arguing for more than half the school districts here in South Carolina?
The principal argument was that South Carolina is just trying to get by with the least they can get by with.
Affecting mainly African-American students.
Affecting mainly African-American students. The people that I represent, the kids I represent, are the poorest and most isolated school children in the state of South Carolina. They are vastly free and reduced lunch kids, so they qualify for all the federal programs. And in rural South Carolina, the most isolated places in South Carolina, free and reduced lunch, or poor, is synonymous with black. That's just a fact. You can look at any of the data. It all correlates directly. Black and poor correlate. That doesn't mean every black person is poor or that every white person is not poor, but it correlates very directly. And so what we were saying to the state of South Carolina is that we have a constitutional covenant that does not exist in the federal Constitution, but it does exist in the South Carolina Constitution, that we will provide an adequate educational opportunity for every child, regardless of where they live or what color they are or whether they're rich or poor or any other circumstance. We will provide an adequate educational opportunity. And what we began to litigate in 1992 was whether the state of South Carolina is in fact doing that. And the first the first ruling of the judge was, if there's an open schoolhouse with a teacher and a blackboard and a piece of chalk, that's all the Constitution requires. And so we were dismissed and kicked out of court, and we took that up to the South Carolina Supreme Court, which ultimately has to decide this, not a U.S. Supreme Court case. And they decided that, no, there is a qualitative aspect to what we promise every child, to what we covenant with every child in South Carolina. And that qualitative aspect is each child in this state is entitled to a safe environment within which to learn, to read, write, and speak the English language and a fundamental knowledge of mathematics and physical science. Notice that's a pretty nice articulation of an individual skill set. A skill set to read, write, add, and subtract basic science and fundamental physical science knowledge. Number two, each child in this same environment is entitled to learn economic systems, political systems, social systems, their own history, and how government works. Notice how that next step is how you interact with other people in an organized democratic society and in a free market economy. A pretty brilliant articulation by the South Carolina Supreme Court of what the Constitution requires. A skill set that gives an individual the capacity to take care of themselves, and then a learning set that gives them the capacity to function in a democratic society and a free market society. And then third, the Supreme Court said in this landmark case that each child is entitled to a set of vocational skills and a set of academic skills, which means to learn for a lifetime and to earn for a lifetime. It means to be able to function economically, vocationally, and to learn, continue to learn over time, academic skills. So it was a brilliant articulation in a case written by Chief Justice Finney, the first African-American justice on the South Carolina Supreme Court since Reconstruction. We took that case back to the South Carolina State Court and litigated whether or not those standards were being met in the 36 school districts that I represent and that we've been privileged to represent. And what we proved in that trial court in 103 days of trial is that our children receive the lowest paid teachers in the state of South Carolina, the most inexperienced teachers in South Carolina, the fewest advanced degrees, the most substitute teachers, the most teachers who speak foreign language as a first language, the fewest advanced degrees, and the least tenured or long-term experience. Meaning that in the classrooms of the kids who need the greatest teachers the most are the least adequate teachers. Now, those teachers I champion because they're out there doing heroic work every day, Mark, and it's a powerful piece. But in addition to that, they have in many cases, the oldest school buildings and the oldest school books, just like they did when Thurgood Marshall argued Brown versus Board of Education in 1948, and that ultimately went up in 1954, was decided. Brown versus Board, as you know, arose out of a petition in Clarendon County, South Carolina. In Clarendon County, South Carolina, there was a petition for a school bus. That's all the parents wanted. The white kids were in a bus. The black kids were walking up to 10 miles a day back and forth to school. And the African-American parents said, I would like to have a school bus for my kids. The state, fortunately, I think for the United States, rejected that. And it became Board of Education, Brown versus Board of Education, here in South Carolina, Briggs versus Elliott. 50 years after that case, we were in court in Clarendon County, Mark, litigating whether or not the kids in Clarendon County and other counties in this state have the opportunity to achieve an adequate education. Now, the Supreme Court, in that brilliant case of Abbeville, in order to get the case decided, Judge Chief Justice Finney had to compromise, and the compromise was to use the term minimally adequate. A minimally adequate opportunity to be educated. Now, to Chief Justice Finney, I can tell you personally, that means nothing. Minimally adequate means adequate. Adequate means meets the needs of the child. Adequate simply means it's adequate to meet the needs of the child to be educated at that point in time. If I just mention to you, I'm thinking about your book and this generation, 4 generations, you say. You know what the greatest predictor of educational achievement of any child anywhere in America, what do you guess that is? Just if you're going to have one thing that would predict educational achievement.
I can't even begin to guess.
Well, I asked you in the car on the way out here about one thing. Do you remember about your mom? What did I ask you?
Where was she from?
No, I asked you.
Did she go to school?
Did she go to college?
Did she go to college?
Her mother went to college. Her dad went to college. Her mom and dad all had advanced degrees. The greatest individual predictor of educational achievement is your mother's education. If your mother has a college education, you're likely not to drop out of high school. If she has a master's degree or a PhD, you're unlikely not to graduate from college. In fact, so when you look back at this, and white people couldn't shake hands with black people, black children couldn't have an adequate school system, mother didn't graduate from high school, what does that predict is going to happen to the child? They're unlikely to have great educational achievement. Mother's not comfortable with those things. Grandmother's not comfortable. Grandfather's not comfortable. And so you build in a set of generational deficits that comes out of this, what people were trying to escape in Isabel's brilliant book, to get an opportunity so that their kids could move forward. So that's really what we're litigating. We're litigating the legacy of Jim Crow. We're litigating the legacy of slavery, if you will, all the way back. But we're also litigating whether or not as a people, we're providing for our children a constitutionally adequate opportunity to be educated, Mark.
I can tell you, as a working journalist in the state for 16, almost 17 years, I don't need 100 days in the courtroom to figure out that there's a lot of inadequate places where we're trying to educate our students. I've been to schools where there are no computers. I'm talking about junior high schools. Dillon High School there, Dillon County in the northeastern part of the state.
J.B. Martin.
With no heat in portions of that building.
Mr. President, J.D. Martin was built the year before Plessy versus Ferguson was decided, 1896.
Which is amazing. And if anybody has not seen or heard of the brilliant documentary Corridor of Shame, it was an outgrowth of a lot of the work that she did, produced in Columbia by a man named Bud Ferrillo, that is worth checking out. It's available online. You can see that today.